There's been a long history of policy grievances as well as constitutional concerns from Western Canada. So today we're going to talk about the question of separation. Should Alberta, let alone Saskatchewan and other parts of Western Canada, separate from this great country? So it's the aftermath of a federal election. We know we have yet another Liberal government, specifically a minority Liberal government led by Prime Minister Mark Carney. And the question is, where do we go from here? We've got major policy choices that face this country, including the economy, as well as, frankly, the unity of this country. So on that note, we're going to talk today about Western separation. And I am very delighted to welcome to the program Dr. Dennis Modry, the chairman of the Alberta Prosperity Project, and lawyer Jeff Rath, who's also general counsel for the Alberta Prosperity Project. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Delighted to be here.
And just one point of clarification, David. Alberta's not separating from Canada. Canada held an election, and Ontario and Quebec voted to separate from Alberta. So all we're doing is moving forward to give effect to that vote that separated Canada from Alberta. So they're the real separatists, not us. We're just giving effect to their wishes.
All right. So within that context, then, this election was clearly a very important election because it sent a signal to you. So Jeff, can you clarify your comments in many ways? A variation of this is years ago, it used to be said that Alberta wants in terms of having more voice and to be heard within the Federation. Is it fair to say now the question is the West wants out?
Well, the West is out. I mean, Ontario and Quebec voted us out in the last federal election. So, and quite frankly, Trudeau voted us out when he invoked the Emergency Measures Act and was trampling little Indigenous women in the street with riot horses because people came to Ottawa from Alberta and other places in Western Canada to protest, liberal totalitarian policy. So, I think we've been out for a while, and all we're doing now with our organization, Dr. Modry, myself, Mitch Sylvester, and literally thousands and thousands and thousands of our fellow Albertans, is to give effect to the wishes of Eastern Canada to have Alberta get the hell out of Canada and form an independent country like we should have been all along.
Okay. So Dr. Modry, can then you just put into perspective here briefly, what is the Alberta Prosperity Project and how do we, what is your goal here when it comes to your efforts?
Well, I'm happy to get into that. I just want to elaborate a little bit on what Jeff just said, because I think it's quite relevant. Albertans are not uninformed on many aspects. They were very much informed about Mr. Carney and his background and his book Values. And his values were to, with respect to our oil and gas industry, was to shut it down. I mean, his wife very much a climate environmentalist, and he's made it very clear through his actions to prevent the development of our oil and gas industry. He has said that very clearly. He is also willing to trample on our rights of free speech, and he has said that as well with respect to bringing in legislation to that particular effect, i.e. the Harms Act. And then he obviously is someone who has a real fetish about controlling everything around him, including the Canadian public, when he wants to introduce a central bank digital currency. And we saw what happened with the trucker convoy when accounts were frozen. Well, you can imagine with the central bank digital currency that he would then be able to absolutely control everything that you spend your money on, and even control the extent of how far you might be able to drive. He has publicly stated you get one air travel trip every 3 years. I mean, these are the kinds of things that don't sit well in terms of the values of Albertans who relish the concept of freedom and prosperity. So why I say this is because this is really the background. These kinds of things that have been happening to Alberta notwithstanding historical grievances going back to the wheat board problems, the national energy policy, the $500 billion of investment that has not taken place in Alberta because of federal policy. These are the kinds of things that have led to the Alberta Prosperity Society being developed in January of 2022. And it was registered with Alberta as a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational society, the purpose of which is to educate the Alberta public on the rationale and merits of Alberta sovereignty. And the mission to accomplish that is to empower a provincial government to restructure Alberta's relationship with Canada. And that means now, very clearly and concisely, Alberta's relationship as a sovereign nation with whatever arrangements, trade arrangements, military cooperation, intelligence cooperation, etc., that a sovereign nation of Alberta might have with Canada. So this grassroots movement, this populist movement, has taken off like wildfire, particularly since the Alberta electorate understands that with an election of Mr. Carney, that we're going to see the same kind of carnage that we've been exposed to for decades now, but particularly for the last 10 or 15 years, which has been absolutely unconscious.
So there's a larger context here. It's not just simply about the last government's continued war on oil and gas. It's a long list of issues, and you said values and differences that really makes in your mind separation is the right policy. Is that right, Jeff?
Well, it's beyond that. I mean, it's not just about grievances. And I actually don't like to focus on grievances because I think, every horrible thing that the Liberal government has done, and it's not just the Liberal government. I mean, it's the structure of Canadian federalism that discriminates against Alberta. Like, combined Nova Scotia and New Brunswick have 20 Senate seats, yet they have less than half of our population. We have 6 Senate seats. Newfoundland, with less population probably than Red Deer, has 6 Senate seats to Alberta's 6 Senate seats. The lack of representation on the Supreme Court, all of those structural issues. Doesn't matter whether it's a Liberal in power or whether it was a majority government under, the globalist federalist Stephen Harper in power. The minute those guys get elected under a federal ticket and start governing Canada, they realize that Canada, as it exists under the current federal system, is completely ungovernable unless you milk Alberta dry for every dollar that you can suck out of us. And, like today, I mean, $15 billion again this year is going to go to Quebec. So Quebec can have gold-plated social services, can have a surplus budget, and Alberta is borrowing money, to hire our doctors, nurses, teachers, build our roads, etc. And then when we want our money back, we have to go to Ottawa on bended knee and say, oh, please, great gazoo, can we have some of our money back? And it's not something that people are willing to tolerate anymore. I mean, it's, the whole structure of the system, a lot of people say this, and Dennis has said it more than once, and I love this comment. I think it started with Ralph Klein. If Alberta was outside of Canada and was an independent country, thriving with its resources and whatever else it is, if somebody came to Alberta with the deal that we're under within Confederation today, nobody in their right mind would agree to it. Like, there's no way in hell that Alberta would join Confederation under the present conditions. So, there's a lot of that that goes on. And then I'll turn it back to the panel. But the other thing we want people to focus on is that, everybody talks about, all the fear mongering and, Alberta's not going to have any more pipelines. And, we'll shut down TMX. The reality of it is that an independent Alberta negotiating with Canada is going to have a tremendous amount of clout. An independent Alberta would be able to levy a 30% tariff on every container car that went through Alberta by rail if anybody wanted to threaten to shut down our pipelines. It's never going to happen because as realistic adults, we're all going to roll up our sleeves and figure out the best way to, for a win-win deal across the board. But, the advantages of Alberta leaving Canada so far outweigh staying in. no more federal taxation at all. So no more federal income tax, no more carbon tax, no more federal corporate tax, no more capital gains tax, no more GST, no more excise tax on fuel. I mean, we have oil and gas producers in Alberta that have to flare gas as a matter of course, to produce oil. And the carbon taxes have become so crippling that even though they have proven reserves in the millions of barrels, they're barely making a profit because of all the crippling carbon taxes that are put on their flaring operations. So all of that would end. I mean, Alberta would be out of the Paris Climate Accord with no more federal taxation. And keep in mind, I mean, there has to be, some level of that money that comes back into Alberta, to pay for whatever few federal services, are being provided that we require. But the simple fact of the matter is because we're no longer going to be taking $70 billion and then filtering it through this grossly disgusting, bloated federal bureaucracy that Trudeau has doubled in size in the last, 10 years, to then have little dribs and drabs of money trickle back to Alberta, whether it be by health transfers or whatever it is. Those days are going to be over. All of our money is going to stay in Alberta. Albertans will have a much more direct link to their representatives who are deciding what taxes we're going to pay, et cetera. We think that, economists that we've talked to, we could see a flat 10% income tax in Alberta. We could see a flat 10% corporate tax in Alberta and no other taxes. And we would be able to live very well, including covering off our 3% GDP military defense requirement. So that's what I want people to focus on, and the citizens of Alberta and other people listening to this. Who the hell wouldn't vote themselves a 30% pay raise by saying, yeah, I want out of Canada and I don't want any more federal taxes or any more federal regulation. So,
okay, so what you're outlining, Jeff, is a full-scale A to Z type of vision for a nation outside, pursuing its sovereignty, pursuing its freedom, its prosperity outside of Canada. That's it, isn't it?
Absolutely. People like to portray all of us as a bunch of dumb Yahoo rednecks that are out in our pastures screaming at our cows. I mean, Dr. Modry is one of the most esteemed physicians in Alberta. He ran the heart and lung pioneered the heart and lung transplant program. At the University of Alberta. He's Stanford educated.
Indeed.
I mean, I have an honors degree of political science from the University of Alberta and an honors degree in law from the London School of Economics. What? We're just going to do things without thinking about it? We're a bunch of yahoos that are just making this stuff up as we go along.
But let's be clear. So our audience joins us from coast to coast to coast. I suspect there'd be an awful lot of Canadians listening to our conversation, and they'd be kind of, maybe shocked, maybe somewhat surprised to hear the far-reaching vision that you have. Is that your take on it too, Dr. Modry? Would you say that many Canadians would be somewhat surprised to hear this conversation, how far-reaching and serious this moment in history is?
Well, that's a good question. I think that many people across the country would relish being able to do what we are contemplating doing. And let me give you one specific example. As David Lametti, the former Minister of Justice in the Trudeau government, the Justin Trudeau government, stated that Canadians do not have the right to own property. Now, let that sink in for everybody. Take your personal home and land where you have no mortgage. You think you own it, but just don't pay your property taxes and you'll find out who really owns it. So one of the points that I'm trying to get at here is that in a new constitution for Alberta, we would be enshrining property rights, and that would include your home and land ownership, which would not be taxed, just like many U.S. states do not tax homes and property or the land. So the opportunities and the benefits to get out from under the oppression of federal regulations and taxations is enormous. Now, as conservatives in Alberta and in Saskatchewan and elsewhere in the West, and I would deign to say as well, elsewhere in Canada, conservatives feel as though in this regime that we're existing under right now, that we're overgoverned, overregulated, and overtaxed. So what's the solution? is to be less governed, less regulated, and less taxed. And that's what will happen to Alberta when Alberta becomes a nation.
And just to be clear, I want to jump in. I mean, this isn't a conservative movement. This is a common sense, populist movement, right? Everybody, like I was laughing the other day. Don Braid was going on about, oh, well, you can't take these people very seriously. Only 40% of conservatives are in favor of independence, and only 4% of the NDP are in favor of independence. So, so that gets us up to 44%. So don't take us seriously at 44% when we haven't even started our education campaign and have really explained the benefits to people of how much better off they're going to be, outside of Canada. And, and again, think about that. I mean, if you're a nurse and you're married to a police officer and you both have 25% taken off of your taxes every year, and your tax bill is going to end up being cut more in half, that's another $30,000 or $40,000 that's going to be staying in that family that they can spend on their kids, that they can spend on vacations, that they can spend investing in their home, investing in their retirements, et cetera. So, as far as we're concerned, I mean, this is a populist movement. We say that APP is nonpartisan because members of every political party, are invited just to think about the actual economic benefits of getting out from underneath, all of the federal taxes and regulations that have been plaguing our province, for decades. I mean, even just recently, my friend Dr. Modry was talking about, David Lametti. Keep in mind, David Lametti is going to be in a Carney government. David Lametti, so obviously he says Canadians don't have a right to property, so he's a communist. And then during, the Freedom Convoy protest in Ottawa, David Lametti was talking to Mark Mendocino, and they were both lamenting the fact that they didn't have Leopard tanks with which they could crush the protesters underneath their treads in, a la Tiananmen Square. So, I mean, Lametti's not only a communist, he's a Stalinist of the worst, stripe. And when they figured out they got caught on a hot mic, oh, well, we were just joking. Oh, wow, crushing your fellow Canadians to death with tanks. Isn't that funny?
Okay, so,
right?
But to be clear, the larger perspective then is that you don't see the change of the Prime Minister to Prime Minister Mark Carney as a hopeful omen that there'll be a change of policy that will enable and empower, provinces, including Alberta, Saskatchewan, among others, to thrive and go forward. That's not going to be enough.
Our message is, so what? It's too little, too late. So what if Mark Carney shows up and says, oh, well, we're going to agree to some pipeline corridors. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Blah, blah, blah. And Albertans don't want to hear it. Danielle Smith and Scott Moe, I understand, because they're politicians and they like to talk, are going to sit down and talk to Mark Carney and see what the best deal is that they can get. Well, I'll tell you what, it doesn't matter what deal they get from Carney. They're never going to get an acknowledgement from Carney that the federal government has no jurisdiction whatsoever over Alberta natural resources. They're never going to get an agreement from Mark Carney to completely eliminate all federal taxes in Alberta and allow Alberta to tax its own citizens and charge the appropriate tax rate acceptable to the citizens of Alberta, under the Property and Civil Rights Clause of the Constitution Act of 1867. Carney's never going to rescind, Trudeau's ridiculous attack on personal property by prohibiting, banning, and threatening to seize 90% of the firearms in Alberta that are lawfully held by lawful gun owners. He's never going to agree to end the No More Pipelines bill. He might set up some corridors, but again, these are going to be so rife with federal regulation and whatever it is. The only benefits that Albertans are going to see from this are going to be 6 years, 7 years down the line. And who knows, by then, we're past 2030, some other liberal is going to tell us that, oh, no, we have the climate emergency is even worse, and we're supposed to be at net zero now. So because of the emergency, we can't keep up with this deal that we made, no pipelines. We can't trust those people. Quebec's
okay, so you'd say, but you'd clearly say, Jeff and Dennis, that Canada's essentially broken. You're at the end of the rope, and some kind of policy adjustments, even with this Carney government, really don't provide you with the answer that you need in terms of your vision for really pursuing a fully prosperous and independent Alberta. Is that the bottom line, Dennis?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you review his book on values, I mean, do people really change their stripes? And is it believable that Mr. Carney will change his perspective based on what he has actually stated about his values? His book is entitled Values, and those are his values. And those values do not align with the majority of Albertans' values.
All right.
And I think that's really important for people to understand that Albertans see Mark Carney and they see Canada as an existential threat to Alberta. And I mean, I can't state that strongly enough. Canada is an existential threat to Alberta. They are bound and determined to destroy this province. Like, just an example, not this last winter, which was pretty mild, but the winter before, we had some really brutally cold -40, -50 days. Our power grid was on the verge of collapse because, of course, without consulting with the Alberta government, without consulting Alberta municipalities, without consulting Albertans, Justin Trudeau flooded Alberta with refugees and immigrants that we do not have the water, we don't have the power, we don't have the jobs, any way whatsoever to take care of. None of this is sustainable, and it almost collapsed our power grid. And we would have had people dying in -50-degree weather because we've been flooded with people from by Ottawa without any thought whatsoever to either the sustainability of the Alberta environment or the sustainability of Alberta infrastructure to cope with this massive influx of population that they foisted upon us without consultation.
Okay, so again, what I'm hearing is that policy issue after policy issue, you think that Alberta is done with the federal government and this country, and
It's
so
a matter.
pursuing that.
It's a matter of survival, David. Like, we're not going to survive with Canada. Canada is trying to kill us, and we're tired of it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The language that you're using, it's very intriguing to hear because it harks back to my memory historically of, many different political philosophers. I think of John Locke's reference to the definition of tyranny is when the sovereign, the king, the federal government in this case, are a threat to one's basically livelihood and future. And so that is the definition of tyranny, quite frankly. So you see it in those terms. Is that correct?
I absolutely see it in those terms. When Justin Trudeau, because he doesn't want to talk to people and doesn't want to hear a different point of view, instead invokes the Emergencies Act and tramples, Indigenous grandmothers in the streets with riot horses, that's tyranny. When Justin Trudeau puts poor little Tamara Leach, who's barely 5 feet tall, weighs 99 pounds soaking wet, they put her in leg irons to drag her across the country on a mischief charge. What is that other than tyranny?
So I want to just help our audience understand, and I want to get your reaction to where we're at today and help us understand through your eyes, your perspective on this process that's unfolding. And it's very dynamic. And I want to share with you, first of all, a clip from the Premier of Saskatchewan, Scott Moe, and his recent statement this past week.
So Canadians have spoken, and I would take this opportunity to congratulate Prime Minister Mark Carney on his election win. Canadians have provided him and your party and your government a new mandate. And while you had very strong support in some parts of Canada, there are many Canadians, including most of us in Saskatchewan, who voted for a degree of change. And now it's up to you to show that you have heard that message and to deliver change, not only for Saskatchewan people, but for many Canadians as well. For Saskatchewan industries that help drive the Canadian economy and very much are part of the Canadian economy, to provide some degree of change for Saskatchewan people. Last night, what I heard was that the Prime Minister Carney had said that he wants to work with both Saskatchewan and Alberta. He's also said that he wants to make Canada into a global leading energy superpower. And that's great to hear, but those are nothing but words. And I would say, and I've said it many times, that policies truly do matter, in particular in this space. And so some of the government's policies, the federal government's policies, they quite simply are going to need to change in order for Canada to achieve that goal. What Prime Minister Carney had said is that we must deal with the United States of America and the Trump administration from a position of strength, and I couldn't agree more with that statement. And making Canada the world-leading energy superpower would be a pretty good start to dealing with the United States as well as any other allied country from a position of strength. We have some ideas on how we can jointly achieve that as a provincial government and what policies this new administration may need to alter to some degree in order for us as Canadians to achieve that global energy superpower. So I would say that this is an opportunity for each and all of us to hit the reset button, if you will, on the federal government's relationship with the province and the people of Saskatchewan. And I hope that this offer is taken. And I would take this opportunity to invite Prime Minister Carney to a meeting here in Saskatchewan where we'd love to host him to chart a productive path forward for our province within the nation of Canada. I want to work alongside this federal government to build a strong and growing Saskatchewan, as I said, within a very united and strong growing nation of Canada. So I look forward to meeting with the new Prime Minister as soon as possible so that we can start working together to achieve that mutual goal that we have.
Okay, so that's a comment from Premier Scott Moe. I know that recently it's been announced that there will be a Premier's meeting with the Prime Minister on June 2nd in Saskatoon. Dennis, is that a sign of a little glimmer of hope there, that the federal government's trying to signal under the new Prime Minister a new tone, a working together, or is it just, frankly, window dressing?
Well, it's like I say, I go back to the book values, and what we've heard from Mr. Carney right now is certain language that seems to be of potential benefit for the West. But rhetoric needs to be followed by action. And until we hear in the strongest terms and we see the legislative proposals, I am extremely skeptical. And I'm skeptical because you made the comment earlier, the perspective of the country being broken. Yes, the country is broken, but it was broken from the get-go because of the way the structure is. And you have to remember that the East is not going to tolerate Alberta becoming the center of economic power in Canada. And Marc Lalonde, in 1980 with the National Energy Policy, is on the record on video of making that very statement. We could not let Alberta become the center of economic power in Canada. So if that is still the perspective of the Eastern Laurentians, if you will, then why would Mr. Carney permit that? When here's a man who was trying to convince banks around the world not to even fund the development of any oil and gas, and also to withdraw any insurance that these companies may have. So I cannot believe that he is going to be the savior of Saskatchewan or Alberta or the West in general. I just don't believe it.
Okay, so a great deal of skepticism there, Jeff.
Well, just to jump in on that, I get, Scott Moe, with the greatest of respect, apparently doesn't understand the amending formula in the Canadian Constitution, and somehow thinks that getting a few little goodies from Mark Carney, is going to solve the problem. It's almost like, oh, look, Mark Carney's coming to visit us in Saskatoon. Isn't that nice? He can pat us on the head while he's telling us what little treats we're going to get to behave ourselves. It's just, it's just patronizing and it's ludicrous. And, and what I say, honestly say to Scott Moe is, Premier Moe, why are you standing in the way of your citizens being completely freed from federal taxation and regulation? To me, he was elected to represent the people of Saskatchewan. And just like Daniel Smith right now, and just like that clown Jason Kenney who's running around trying to be the, king, Captain Federalist, they seem to forget that they're responsible and elected to the people. They don't have the people's best interests in heart. I mean, Jason Kenney is an example. He's just waiting for the minute that he can stab Pierre Poilievre in the back and take his job. And he thinks politically that the way he's going to get there is by being this strong federalist so that he can pick up votes in Ontario and Quebec. That's the nature of Canadian federalism. It's like you've got all these federalist leaders or politicians that somehow think that they're tied to this horrible, tyrannical system that just completely subjugates and oppresses the West and has from day one, and that somehow or other we should be grateful for it and pay lip service to it on an ongoing basis. All of these people need to fundamentally have a mental paradigm shift, or they need, the old army saying, lead, follow, get out of the way. And I think it's time for all of them just to get out of the way.
Okay, so you're really challenging all the premiers. And speaking of premiers, let's hear this word from Danielle Smith as her response this week as well.
We have fought these attacks from Ottawa furiously and have won some important battles. But the lost opportunities, jobs, and futures of so many Albertans are costly and demoralizing, as are the growing number of Eastern politicians who choose to openly demonize and target Alberta for political gain. That is why a large majority of Albertans are so deeply frustrated with the results of last week's federal election. It's not that our preferred candidate and party lost. That happens in a democracy. Is that the same Liberal government with almost all the same ministers responsible for our nation's inflation, housing, crime, and budget crisis, and that oversaw the attack on our provincial economy for the past 10 years, have been returned to power. Now, as we all know, one thing has changed. We have a new Prime Minister. And I will say that in my first conversation with him since the election, he had some promising things to say about changing the direction of his government's anti-resource policies. However, Albertans are more of a actions speak louder than words kind of people. So while I will in good faith work with Prime Minister Mark Carney on unwinding the mountain of destructive legislation and policies that have ravaged our provincial and national economies this past decade, until I see tangible proof of real change, Alberta will be taking steps to better protect ourselves from Ottawa. As a start, I will soon appoint a special negotiating team to represent our province in negotiations with the federal government on the following reforms requested by our province. We hope this will result in a binding agreement that Albertans can have confidence in. Call it an Alberta Accord, if you will. First, Alberta requires guaranteed corridor and port access to tidewater off the Pacific, Arctic, and Atlantic coasts for the international export of Alberta oil, gas, critical minerals, and other resources in amounts supported by the free market rather than by the dictates and whims of Ottawa. Every province in the country, other than Alberta and Saskatchewan, have coastal port access, and no province needs it more given the size and value of our resources. This will benefit all Canadians to the tune of trillions of dollars of economic activity, including billions for First Nations partners. Second, the federal government must end all federal interference in the development of provincial resources by repealing the No New Pipelines Law, C-69, the oil tanker ban, the net zero electricity regulations, the oil and gas emissions cap, the net zero vehicle mandate, and any federal law or regulation that purports to regulate industrial carbon emissions, plastics, or the commercial free speech of energy companies. These laws are destroying investment confidence and costing Canada and Alberta hundreds of billions in investments each year. They need to go. Third, the federal government must refrain from imposing export taxes or restrictions on the export of Alberta resources without the consent of the government of Alberta. Frankly, all provinces should be given that same respect for their resources. And fourth, the federal government must provide to Alberta the same per capita federal transfers and equalization as is received by the other three largest provinces, Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. We have no issue with Alberta continuing to subsidize smaller provinces with their needs, but there is no excuse for such large and powerful economies like Ontario, Quebec, BC, or Alberta to be subsidizing one another. That was never the intent of equalization, and it needs to end. If these points can be agreed to by the federal government, I am convinced it will not only make Alberta and Canada an infinitely stronger and more prosperous country, but will eliminate the doubts a growing number of Albertans feel about the future of Alberta in Canada. While these negotiations with Ottawa are ongoing, our government will appoint, and I will chair, the Alberta Next panel. This panel will be composed of some of our best and brightest judicial, academic, and economic minds to join with me in a series of in-person and online town halls to discuss Alberta's future in Canada, and specifically, what next steps we can take as a province to better protect Alberta from any current or future hostile policies of the federal government. Details of the membership and scope of that panel will be released in the coming weeks. After the work of the panel is finished, it is likely we will place some of the more popular ideas discussed with the panel to a provincial referendum so that all Albertans can vote on them sometime in 2026. To be clear from the outset, our government will not be putting a vote on separation from Canada on the referendum ballot. However, if there is a successful citizen-led referendum petition that is able to gather the requisite number of signatures requesting such a question to be put on a referendum, our government will respect the democratic process and include that question on the 2026 provincial referendum ballot as well. I also want to state unequivocally that as Premier, I'm entirely committed to protecting, upholding, and honoring the inherent rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Therefore, any citizen-initiated referendum question must not violate the constitutional rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and must uphold and honor Treaties 6, 7, and 8, should any referendum question ever pass. This is non-negotiable. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, that being separation. We are well aware that there is a large and growing number of Albertans that have lost hope in Alberta having a free and prosperous future as a part of Canada. Many of these Albertans are organizing petitions to trigger a citizen-initiated referendum, as I mentioned earlier. The vast majority of these individuals are not fringe voices to be marginalized or vilified. They are loyal Albertans. They are quite literally our friends and neighbors who've just had enough of having their livelihoods and prosperity attacked by a hostile federal government. They're frustrated, and they have every reason to be. I want to talk directly to those Albertans. I know how frustrated so many of you have become with our country and the feeling of having politicians living thousands of miles away passing laws and rules that have cost you your loved ones, jobs, careers, dreams, and opportunities for a brighter future. As most Albertans know, I have repeatedly stated I do not support Alberta separating from Canada. I personally still have hope that there is a path forward for a strong and sovereign Alberta within a united Canada.
All right, so there you have quite an interesting set of statements, policy requirements, and processes in play there from an accord of policy negotiations, requirements, or demands, as well as this effort to negotiate the relationship with the federal government, and then finally the reference to, well, a referendum that could be held in 2026. So you're shaking your head, Jeff. Are you skeptical about this rollout of this process?
Yeah, it's all smoke and mirrors. Let's be really clear. Danielle Smith is currently a Federalist, okay? So she's on Team Canada. Her continued mantra is, strong Alberta within a strong Canada, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. She's actively, she's actively opposed to independent Alberta, separate and apart from Canada. And this whole charade that she's announcing, so they're going to have a what next panel, and then they're going to, out of the what next panel, I already have it from very good sources within the government, they're going to have a referendum on Alberta pensions, Alberta policing, all these other things that were part of Rob Anderson, her chief of staff's Free Alberta strategy. And then they're going to try to run all of those questions simultaneous to the question on should Alberta, become a sovereign, independent country and no longer a province of Canada. And the reason they're doing that is to completely undermine the question that we've developed through legal counsel that completely complies with the Clarity Act, and by saying, do you want an Alberta pension? Do you want Alberta police force? All these other things. To the extent that they get people that are buying into those things, they can say, oh, okay, well, this now creates a bunch of ambiguity around the referendum question because that presupposes that we stay in Canada. It's just a carnival trick as far as I'm concerned. And it's more than a little bit upsetting to all of the people that support the Alberta Prosperity Project. And there are hundreds of thousands of us, right?
Hundreds of thousands.
Absolutely. It's already, out in public, and people already understand that we have more pledges for referendum petition signatures than are going to be required under Alberta law. So a referendum is a certainty. And now, because they know it's a certainty, they're trying to basically undermine the referendum process by, piling all these other questions on top and confusing the issue. And it's just a cheap political trick. And quite frankly, as an organization and as, our membership, we're not going to stand for it. We want to have a referendum.
Okay, so you're reacting against that pathway. It sounds like you've got, according to your numbers, significant support to move on a referendum. So Dennis, what's your response to these series of steps?
Yeah, let me weigh in on this. Her comments are extremely incomplete. There's no question that what she said is what we want. We can have all of those things in a sovereign Alberta. But let's look at the record. She had the unilateral right, without having to change the Constitution or anything, but she could have simply notified Ottawa that she was going to take control of provincial policing, an Alberta pension plan, immigration, employment insurance, and provincial tax collection. Unilateral. Yes. She could have just done that. Second, we're now in a situation of, talk about an abusive relationship. The provincial government has some 18 lawsuits against the federal government right now.
18?
Yes. So why does it even make sense to be in a relationship when you're constantly suing your partner in this marriage, which has already broken down? But it was...
And just to clarify, Dennis, so what would be the nature of those lawsuits? Please remind us of those.
The lawsuits have to do with a whole variety of things. The issues of censorship, the issues, and there are multiple ones in relation to that. On Bill C-69...
Resources, carbon tax, all that.
Yeah, well, basically all these conditions and more that she even stated, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so we can get out from all of this mess, all of this litigation, and all of this oppression simply by becoming a sovereign, independent Commonwealth country to our own. So and we've come a long ways, as Jeff has said. We already have a plurality that would vote in favor of the petition to force the referendum, but we want to build that to an even greater number, and we have some time to be able to achieve that objective. And we're working, to do exactly that. I mean, we've onboarded something north of 15,000 volunteers as well.
Remarkable. 15,000.
15,000 volunteers. Yeah.
We now have more volunteers in APP than there is infantry in the Canadian Army. Think about that.
Okay, so just to put this in perspective, so the kind of work that you've been doing, and I know there's a variety of actors. I don't totally understand the nature and scope of the movement, but your work has 15,000 volunteers alone. So what's motivating so many, in this case, Albertans to come forward and work so hard as part of this? They're just fed up. Is that it?
Well, the election of Mark Carney was the final insult, right? It was, like I said earlier, and I can't state that too lightly. Ontario and Quebec voted to separate from Alberta, and we're going, great, pitter patter, let's get at her and let's get this done.
Okay, but I would like to suggest something that perhaps I'm not totally dismissing your take on the election, But I'm wondering if there's a psychology that happens. I look at the results of the federal election. It seems to me that a number of people voted for the Liberal Party, in part because they thought somehow they were fighting an existential battle against a guy named, what is it again? Oh yeah, President Donald Trump. So there's a kind of a sense that, well, this party would be the best way to safeguard their future. And ironically, it's a bit like your comments on the Western side, certainly in Alberta, saying we see our own federal government as an existential threat to our own future. I mean, isn't there kind of a paradox to this whole thing?
No, there's no paradox at all. I mean, it's Albertans have felt this way for a long time. So it's not, and again, it's not just the election of Mark Carney. I think that was effectively the straw that broke the camel's back, right? We were going to be proceeding forward. We were going to be proceeding forward to a referendum this year, even if Pierre Poilievre won. Because quite frankly, Pierre Poilievre is an Eastern Federalist. He has no business running.
Wait a second. So you're saying, Jeff, that you would see the same policy path of separation even if a Conservative government had been elected?
Yeah, because they're elected to operate a broken federal system that's an existential threat to Alberta.
Okay.
Pierre Poilievre stated before, in the course of this election, he is going to do nothing to stop equalization payments and $15 billion a year going to Quebec from Alberta. He stated that he's not going to do a damn thing to change the Canadian Dairy Marketing Board system, which in effect is at the heart, if you look at trade irritants, has been at the heart of every trade dispute with the United States going back for decades. So in effect, Pierre Poilievre was following along with Mark Carney and said, hey, I'm prepared to put the entire national economy at risk because of a bunch of multi-millionaire cow farm license holders, predominantly out of Quebec. And I'm here to appease Quebec, and we don't care what economic damage it does to Alberta. Like I jokingly said the other day, hey, Pierre, if you want to run in Alberta, I have a slogan for you. Here's your slogan. No more Alberta tax dollars for Quebec and a milk cow and micro dairy in every bar. I double dog dare you.
Okay. So, but this is, again...
And if you can't say that, you're not an Albertan. And in my respectful view, you have no goddamn business running for office in Alberta.
Okay, so this is, again, the bigger picture is that we've got a system that provinces, including Alberta, are caught in, and it's just not going to change. I think that's really what I'm hearing again and again here.
Exactly. The key thing here, and we've sort of stated it, but let me state it even more concise. What we're up against is voter-rich Eastern Canada opposing resource-rich, voter-poor Alberta and Saskatchewan. So they control us in a way in which we do not want to be controlled.
Okay.
The other thing is they're an extremely gullible electorate. I mean, and we saw that in the last election. Like, you're watching Pierre Poilievre's numbers going up in Toronto, in Toronto, and it's looking like, hey, Poilievre's finally turned it around. He might actually be able to squeak out a minority. And then what happens? Even though he'd been quiet for 3 weeks, President Trump starts up with all of the 51st state stuff again and reminded everybody in Quebec and Ontario that Donald Trump is an existential threat and that, that the only guy to do this is Carney. Trump did it on purpose. He really did want Carney to be prime minister, because I think Trump is smart enough to know that electing Carney as prime minister means the end of Alberta and Canada. And if Alberta, if Alberta leaves and Quebec is no longer sucking on the Alberta teat and taking $15 billion a year out of our province, Quebec's got no reason to stay in Canada. So Alberta's going to be gone. Quebec's going to be gone. Saskatchewan's going to be gone. Carney's going to be the last prime minister of Canada as we know it, and it serves him right.
Wow. Well, it's an interesting theory about Donald Trump and his proclivity to tweet. And certainly on even the day of the election, I'd like to ask him.
I was in Washington, D.C. when he was doing it. Everybody in D.C. knew what he was doing, and they were laughing about it. Dennis was there with me.
Interesting. Well, sounds like that's almost for another discussion. So I did want to ask more about Western alienation and this issue of separation, because I'm intrigued that this isn't just simply an Alberta moment, and I'm not asking you to speak on others, but I do want to make reference. I understand there's a poll in British Columbia where some 28% of British Columbians are open to some option of separation.
If you were to take a pen and circle out the Lower Mainland and probably
Yes.
stop halfway up the Fraser Valley, like
Right.
Chilliwack, and left all of that on the west coast with Victoria and the Gulf Islands, right? And then ask the rest of British Columbia how they would vote, the rest of British Columbia would join Alberta and separate.
And what is your take, based on your research, what is your take then in terms of this separation movement within Manitoba then?
I haven't paid a lot of attention to Manitoba. I mean, I think their culture is significantly different from Alberta and Saskatchewan. I'm sure there's a chunk of Western Manitoba that would feel that way, but I've worked and done business in and around Winnipeg off and on for years, and there's a very strong socialist left wing NDP culture in that province that probably wouldn't fit very well philosophically with the rest of us. I think that's a fair statement.
But the point is, this is not just an Alberta movement. Would that be a fair comment? There's also in BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan primarily. Is that right?
Well, to be clear, our movement is strictly an Alberta movement. Okay, so but that having been said, I mean we're in touch with and in communication with sister movements in Saskatchewan, in British Columbia, et cetera. And we're always open to talking, to other people. In fact, there's going to be a delegation coming from Saskatchewan to meet with us, this Sunday, to talk to us about how, what we're doing, how we've achieved what we've achieved, basically using what we're doing as a template, to get Saskatchewan, moving in the same direction at the same speed with the same momentum, right?
Okay.
So there's definite interest. There's definite interest in Saskatchewan. And again, who the hell wouldn't be interested in completely ending all federal taxation and regulation in the province? Everybody's lives would be so much better.
So I did have a question for both of you, and that relates to, well, I just got back from Ottawa, and what struck me there in my conversation with so many others is almost like we're kind of living in a world of disconnects of communication, to put it politely. I picked up a Globe and Mail, which I am known to do from time to time, and I was amazed by at least my basic reading that somehow the separation movement in Western Canada is viewed as a fringe movement. It's viewed as somehow a bunch of kooks, to put it politely, who are simply at 30%.
David, I want to correct you on that. According to Jason Kenney, I am a traitorous kook. So I really want to...
you may be called by some as traitorous, whatever that means exactly. But the point is that the separatist movement in Western Canada is by some portrayed as a fringe movement, as even traitorous. But the point is, how do you respond to that? Is the historically some would say that the movement has been kind of stuck at around 30%. Is it more than that? What is your case?
Let me start off with this one. For one thing, I don't like the term a separatist movement. It sort of implies taking Alberta and moving it to another region in the world. What we're talking about is the sovereignist movement. It's Alberta to become a sovereign nation. And insofar as polling is concerned, I mean, how accurate was the polling prior to the U.S. election? It certainly wasn't very accurate at all. And in this era of cancel culture, many people do not want to answer a question regarding controversial issues. And it's becoming a lot less controversial, the issue of Alberta sovereignty, but still many people, may not want to answer the question to a pollster, but will vote different at the time. And although it's not related directly, there is an indirect sense when you go back to the 2021 referendum on ending equalization. Remember, 62% of Albertans voted to end equalization. Well, if 62% of Albertans voted for Alberta to become a sovereign nation, the problem of equalization is resolved, as well as an Alberta pension plan, as well as replacing as well as complete control of our healthcare system, for example, etc. So, and we'd be out from under any risk of a central bank digital currency or censorship, that sort of thing. So the benefits to Albertans are really enormous, and they're starting to understand it, which is why this movement is growing like it is.
The other thing to remember, too, is that Albertans are remarkably well educated, right? So, I think at one point we had the highest number of university degrees per capita of any jurisdiction in North America, right? So Albertans are not stupid people. They're very thoughtful, intelligent people, right? So when we hear all of the Twitter trolls and all of the, all of the silly arguments coming up, it's like, oh, well, if Alberta leaves, you're not going to have any more health transfers. And what are you going to do then? And we're laughing and we're going, well, duh. It's like the health transfers that come back to Alberta are because we send $70 billion a year to Ottawa, and then Ottawa decides what little pittance they send back to us in health transfers after they divvy up all of our tax money between Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, and all the other Liberal voting areas that they want to buy off for the next election. So, there's this fundamental disconnect of all the left-wing legacy media people that somehow think that Alberta is beholden to Canada for tax dollars, like even the TMX pipeline. Oh, what would you have done if there had been $34 billion to build the TMX pipeline? And the first answer to which is, well, we didn't need your goddamn money if industry had just been allowed to build the thing within budget like they wanted to do. And then second of all, $34 billion is less than Alberta gets sucked out of Alberta every year to never return. 70 billion goes, we get 33 billion back, and that includes 3 billion in CPP. So, Alberta is literally on the short end of the stick of our own money. And I mean, the day we declare independence, we're going to have the highest GDP per capita of any country in the world, including Dubai. So, I mean, everybody, needs to understand that, all of these silly threats and all of this, oh my goodness, what are you going to do without federal money? It's not federal money, it's our money that then gets filtered through this bloated federal bureaucracy and then just comes back to us in drips and drabs, when we have to go on bended knee to Ottawa. I mean, we're not going to have to put up with any of that anymore.
The TMX pipeline, David, the TMX pipeline, it cost 5 times as much to finish the TMX pipeline as it would have cost if Enbridge had just finished it.
Yes.
Okay. This is the inefficiency of government. And for your listeners, you need to understand that in general, for every product or service that the private sector can provide to you for $1, the federal government will charge you at least $3 or more to provide that same product or service. That's the inefficiency of government, which is why many people want to be less governed, less regulated, and less taxed.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. So I did have a question quickly about the impact you think that economic policies, what kind of impact do economic policies have on this movement towards sovereignty?
Well, let me give you an overarching comment. When you have the least regulated, least governed, and least taxed region in the world, business will flock to Alberta like we've never seen before. The economy will absolutely boom. And when Jeff says become the number 1 GDP per capita region in the world, that's actually true. Let's look at the evidence for that. In the 70s, there was a massive demographic shift in people and businesses coming to Alberta from elsewhere in Canada and around the world. Why? Liquid gold, oil. And this is what generated...
natural gas.
There was so much wealth coming to Alberta in the 70s that by 1980, when that national energy policy was passed, which is really what got me going on this whole quest for Alberta sovereignty, that's when Marc Lalonde justified the national energy policy under Pierre Elliott Trudeau by saying we couldn't let Alberta become the economic center of power in Canada. And, 5 major banks were planning to move their head offices to Calgary. One did, CIBC at the time. So this is a very real threat to central Canada, Alberta secession. But at the end of the day, other regions in the country are going to have to ask themselves, do they want to continue under the same form of governance? And I don't think they will. I think they will be advocating for a change in government as well.
Oh.
And
okay,
now,
so do you mean, Dennis, in the sense that the sovereignty movement in Alberta, in your case,
yes,
is really a call for provincial sovereignty that's relevant for every province in this country?
Well, it is because when you take the issue of sovereignty, it's really self-governance without external interference. That's in general the definition of sovereignty. And at the individual level, when you are paying excessive taxation, you are limiting your ability to purchase the goods and services that you want for yourself and your family. So you're compromising your own sovereignty. And when we talk about Alberta sovereignty, we talk about it at the individual level and at the provincial level. And if you want it at the federal level, the federal government needs to get out from under the control of the WEF and the World Health Organization as well. But the issue of sovereignty needs to be understood by your listeners that it occurs at more than one level. But think about it, how it affects you and your family. Let me give you one example. The average worker in Alberta makes $78,000 a year. When you strip out all the taxes that person pays, and Jeff outlined them all, when you strip them all out, you actually are left with $31,000 of actual purchasing power. $31,000. What we're proposing for that same individual would result in that same individual having $68,000 to $70,000 of actual purchasing power. What does actual purchasing power mean? It means that you're purchasing a product or a service for which there is no tax attached to it whatsoever. That's what it means.
Okay, so this is clearly coming. This sovereignty movement is coming out of a long history of frustration, of federal intrusion into provincial jurisdiction that is doing great harm to citizens because of it, in terms of undermining prosperity and opportunity. So on that note, we've had a far-reaching conversation today. I'm wondering if there's little glimmers of hope here. And when it comes to, I know that Premier Doug Ford of Ontario has even said, hey, we need to pay attention to the sovereignty movement. I know that Wab Kinew, the Premier of Manitoba's even started to push the concept of an energy corridor right across Western Canada to Hudson's Bay. I believe it would be Port Nelson, so we could bypass the frustrations of dealing with Quebec and accepting pipelines. Does that give you any hope?
No, well, I mean, it gives me hope to the extent that they're now acknowledging that those deals are on the table. But for me, the real hope and the real glimmer of hope is the fact that we now have 65% of the Conservative Party of Alberta members in support of independence. Danielle Smith was at an event last night. Dennis was there. You can
pardon me. Can you repeat that? Can you repeat that figure, Jeff?
65% of members of the Conservative Party of Alberta support independence. Danielle Smith was at an event last night in Bonnyville, a premier's dinner, and the question was asked, how many people in this room support a strong Alberta within Canada? Nobody raised their hands. She asked, how many people in this room support an independent Alberta free of Canada? Everybody in the room raised their hands. So there's this overwhelming groundswell of support. And interestingly, just today, this is an anecdote, but it's hilarious. So we're having a press conference on Monday where we're going to unveil and announce the exact form of the referendum question that's going to be on the ballot. So I had my office phone into Staples, and they made a really nice big signboard with the referendum question on it. And as my assistant is walking out of the store with the signboard that people could read, the staff in the store are going, is that for real? This is great. When can we have this happen? When can we vote? This is awesome. And I mean, this is literally like man on the street stuff. People.
Well, I think we have a slide here of that question that we can share with the audience. Can you tell us the significance of why this is worded? Do you agree that the province of Alberta shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province of Canada? Yes or no?
Exactly. So why is it worded that way? It's because Keith Wilson and I, who's a friend and colleague, he and I got out the secession reference. We read it. We got out the Clarity Act. We read it. We read all the previous referendum questions from Quebec, and we drafted a question that completely complies with Section 1, Sub D, Sub 4 of the Clarity Act, which states that a question for a province to legally leave Canada must be absolutely clear and state that the province intends to become an independent country and intends to leave Canada. So that question was drafted in complete compliance with the Clarity Act and is 100% legal within the framework of secession that's been set out by both the Supreme Court of Canada and the Clarity Act. So unlike the waffly, wishy-washy questions that Quebec put forward along the lines of, and I can't remember word for word, I don't have my binder in front of me.
Sovereignty Association?
But it was on the lines, do you agree on Quebec sovereignty in accordance with the terms of the statute drafted on such and such a date and the agreement passed on whatever date of blah, 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 blah. So it's this completely vague question where people voting, there's nobody voting had given a copy of the statute or a copy of the agreement referred to in the question, so nobody knew what the hell they were voting for, right? So Jean Chrétien actually did us a favor by passing the Clarity Act to show us exactly what we have to do legally to take Alberta the hell out of Canada. And we're confident that not only can we have a referendum this year, notwithstanding Danielle's best efforts to delay us and to and to hold us off until she has time to talk for 6 months with Mark Carney. And we're going to be fighting tooth and nail to have the referendum held this year on that question. And we're going to be reminding Danielle at every turn that she is completely out of touch with her own base and her own party, and that probably, as things stand today, at least 3/4 of Conservative constituencies would vote solidly in favor of independence if the referendum was held tomorrow.
Okay. So there you have it. As spoken by you, Jeff Rath, and Dennis Modry, there's a wave here in terms of interest and energy behind sovereignty for Alberta. And your prediction is the referendum will be held this year. What about Indigenous leaders? I want to share a clip here that expresses some of that concern that's rising here.
Pack up your bag and go. That's my message to the Premier. You're not welcome here anymore.
Chief Alan Adam fed up with Alberta's Premier and her policies. Those include a move to lower the number of signatures required to start a referendum vote, even one on Alberta separation. That bill, number 54, literally thrown on the ground at a Chiefs press conference in Edmonton on Tuesday.
We're very concerned about the rhetoric around separation because it fundamentally forgets that we are the rightful owners of this land.
The Grand Chief of Treaty 8 believes Alberta is doing a terrible job of consulting with First Nations on a number of bills.
All Seasons Resorts Act, the regulations that have been changed when it comes to hunting, Bill 54, it doesn't end. And we have concern about where she's getting the ideas for a lot of these bills. Where are they coming from?
In addition to lowering referendum thresholds and extending the time allowed to gather signatures, Bill 54 also bans voting tabulators, beefs up ID requirements, and allows corporate and union donations back into Alberta politics. Political scientist Jared Wesley has said the bill mirrors anti-democratic tactics used by U.S. President Donald Trump. The government is defending Bill 54, saying it will strengthen trust in our voting systems, adding the current threshold for getting a referendum started is so high, it's almost impossible to actually have any. The province's Indigenous Relations Minister acknowledging tensions amongst chiefs are high right now, mostly over separation talk.
Well, I'd like to run and hide, but no, I can't do that, not allowed. So, I mean, I'm going to have to stand up there and take the heat, and whatever happens, happens. But, like I say, I've got a good relationship with the chiefs, and they know I've got a heart for them, and I want to continue working with them.
The Premier's office did not respond directly to Chief Adams' comments, but repeated her position that any referendums will not violate treaty rights.
Everybody's entitled to their opinion. including the chief. And the Premier's doing a great job. We'd be poorer without her.
As for Bill 54, the NDP says they will work around it when it passes.
We will ensure that we drive people to the polls and get them their ID and make sure that they are able to vote if they want to vote. Because unlike our opponents opposite, we believe in democracy.
From Edmonton, Sean Amato, City News.
So there's a lot of issues here, but Dennis and Jeff, help us understand the response to concerns by some First Nation leaders that they be involved too and have a voice.
I'd like to jump in and address that. First of all, and I'm sure you're aware of that, David, but for your viewers, I have spent my entire career advancing the treaty and Aboriginal rights of the Indigenous nations of Alberta. In fact, one of the cases that I won in a 9-0 decision at the Supreme Court of Canada called the Mikisew Cree versus Sheila Copps is, has been written about by legal scholars as being one of the most important treaty rights cases ever decided in Canada, going back to St. Catherine's Billings decision. Okay. So I would not be doing this if I did not believe in my heart of hearts that Alberta First Nations were going to be substantially better off following the independence of Alberta from Canada. I have spent my entire career suing Canada on behalf of First Nations. Canada does the same thing to First Nations and actually treats them worse than they treat Albertans, forcing First Nations where there's a clear treaty right, to whatever it is, whether it's education, whether it's economic benefits, or agricultural benefits, etc., to fight for decades and come on bended knee to get settlements that amount to pennies on the dollar, out of the so-called federal largesse that is complete and utter nonsense. So, what I would ask the chiefs, and I would like them to consider, is please consider Alberta independence not as a challenge, but as a real opportunity. And I would also ask them to consider why it is that they're so adamant that Alberta keeps sending $15 billion a year to Quebec and all this other money going out to all these other jurisdictions, when that money could remain in Alberta to form the basis of a constitutionalized resource revenue sharing provision in the new Alberta Constitution that would see their community revenues triple or quadruple or quintuple, and to actually give their communities the tools that they need to actually thrive within a thriving Alberta economy. I've personally gone door to door in northern communities, in Indigenous communities on reserves in northern Alberta, and I will tell you, it will break your heart to see the way that these people and the poverty that they have been forced to live in by the government of Canada. We still have communities in Alberta that don't have safe drinking water. We have, families living 3 and 4 families to a small, CMHC Indian Affairs approved, home that's literally falling down around them, that's just chock filled with black mold and whatever else. The health conditions and the living conditions that Alberta Indigenous people have been forced to live in Alberta as a result of the way that the federal government has mistreated them over the decades is beyond a national embarrassment. It is completely despicable. So, what I would, and we're obviously starting and moving forward with engagement with the Indigenous community. The very reason I was involved in founding the Alberta Prosperity Project with Dennis Modry was my concern that a lot of the independence groups and parties in Alberta were not sufficiently well educated on the issues of treaty and Aboriginal rights in Alberta, and seemed to be forwarding, this complete non-starter of an idea that somehow or other Alberta independence would mean they got to wave a magic fairy wand and make Indians and First Nations rights in Alberta disappear. So what we did when we founded the Alberta Prosperity Project, one of our other founding directors was Lawrence Courtoret, a vice chief of the Assembly of First Nations, who worked with me to come up with the Aboriginal policy for the APP that will find its way into the new Alberta Constitution, for an independent Commonwealth of Alberta. So far from independence being a threat to treaty and Aboriginal rights in Alberta, that this is a real opportunity for First Nations to actually engage in a real First Ministers Conference, as equals with the new Commonwealth of Alberta government under a new constitution, to constitutionalize their rights and interests in the province. And I can assure every First Nations person watching this that it will be over my dead body that any Alberta Constitution does not contain, a provision enshrining and protecting treaty and Aboriginal rights in Alberta, as a matter of the most fundamental law in this province, as well as constitutionalizing a resource revenue sharing agreement, with regard to, all resources and resource revenues derived on all treaty lands across the province. I have a hard time believing that under those circumstances, that whatever the fiscal arrangement is between Alberta and fiscal arrangement and rights relationship Alberta First Nations will have with the independent Commonwealth of Alberta, that it won't be 100 times better than anything they had with Ottawa, and would certainly provide them the resources and constitutionalized guarantees of funding that would allow their communities to thrive well beyond the levels of abject poverty that have been inflicted upon them by the government of Canada over the last 150 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me just add one thing, Dave.
Yes.
Let me just add one thing to this. I encourage your readers to go to the albertaprosperityproject.com website, hit the education tab, and there's a document there. It's Proposed Policies and Governance of the Sovereign Nation of Alberta. And there's an Indigenous section that was drafted by Jeff with input from Lawrence Corderay, which he mentioned, and you can read it yourself, and you can see just how massive the benefits will be to First Nations as a result of what Jeff has just said, constitutionalizing their rights in a new Alberta Constitution.
And something else, David, too, that I want people to hear from me loud and clear. The citizens of Alberta that are part of our movement, that attend APP meetings and town halls and rallies, they are overwhelmingly in favor of constitutionalized protection of treaty and Aboriginal rights in Alberta. Every time this subject comes up at an APP meeting or town hall or rally, and I answer the question substantially in the manner that I've just answered it now, I get a massive ovation with everybody in the audience applauding, because I think fundamentally most Albertans deep down are extremely fair people, and they are embarrassed with the level of poverty that has been inflicted upon our Indigenous people, by the government of Canada, and we all want to see an end to it once and for all.
Okay.
And contrary to Mr. Adam, Chief Adam, there are many other chiefs that are very much First Nations chiefs that are very much in support of Alberta sovereignty because they understand the benefits.
All right. So as we wrap up our discussion, we certainly have learned an awful lot about the nature of the sovereigntist movement in Alberta and beyond from both of you. What are the next steps, Dennis, in terms of the referendum and how citizens can be involved?
Well, the next steps are that we're building the movement. So we're having some 50 or 60 town halls. I think about 32 of them have been scheduled already over the next few months. So we're going to be onboarding a lot more people so that we can actually exceed the current threshold, which is 600,000. We'd like to get to 600,000 or 800,000, when we launch the petition. Now, that new petition number of 177,000 won't be proclaimed into law until sometime in June. But the timing of holding the petition is going to be an internal matter and for the board of directors to make that decision. If possible, can we hit the target for a fall referendum? Some have the view that strike while the iron is hot. Well, that there's a lot of truth to that, but there's also truth to building the momentum. We're somewhere around 220,000 people now who have registered. Okay,
remarkable.
And around that 220,000 or so is a larger circle of people that will support the referendum. We're at 700,000 or 800,000 when we launch the petition. The number of people that will support the referendum will be much larger than that. So our target really is something in the order of 1.5, 1.6 million who will support the referendum. So our steps are to grow the movement. We'll make a decision at the board level as to the timing of when we hold this petition. And then subsequently, it will be up to the provincial government. When we submit the petition to Elections Alberta and it's certified, it will go to the provincial government, and they will decide, when it is they will hold the referendum. I mean, in the best case scenario, if we knew now that we had 700,000 or 800,000, we would want to see that referendum take place perhaps at the same time as the municipal elections, which is October the 25th this year. I don't know if we can achieve that objective, but it's, like I said, it's an internal discussion. The other thing I think you need to know, just to show you how far we've come, on the day that the election or the referendum is held, and when it is successful, then we have an expectation that other countries will acknowledge Alberta's sovereignty at that particular time. And this is what the United Nations requires in terms of the recognition of a sovereign country, okay? And that is that there be a successful referendum that is then acknowledged by other countries. And we know that the U.S. would be the first country that would acknowledge that success. To the extent that what we've also done is have created an interim transitional constitution, okay? We're just viewing the details of that now, but it goes to show you how far we've come. So in the aftermath of a successful referendum, there has to be a structure in place for the governance of the new country, following which there will be a constitutional conference in order to modify that interim constitution, and the new government is in place. So there has been a tremendous amount of work that has been done.
Indeed, yes.
We have also addressed every single concern and question that anybody could possibly ask with respect to Alberta sovereignty, whether it relates to currency, the false notion of landlocked, we're really policy locked, etc. So all of the questions we have addressed. That's why when Jeff says we've been at this for a few years now, for myself personally, I've been at this for decades.
Remarkable. Well, I want to thank both of you, Dr. Dennis Modry, the chair of the Alberta Prosperity Project, as well as lawyer Jeff Rath, counsel for the Alberta Prosperity Project. It's been a remarkable discussion, and I hope very helpful to our audience to understand the nature of the sovereignty movement, not only for Alberta, but for Western Canada. And these are very real concerns, and it's clearly a historic time for our country. So thank you very much for this conversation, Dennis and Jeff.
Thank you for having us on, David. It was a really wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for your questions. Very good. Take care.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.